Okay, I think let's aim for 11:45, and then we can have some Q&A for a few minutes after that, if that's fine.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I won't take that. Yeah, that's
okay. That's absolutely
that's fine. I won't actually take that long. So leave some time for Q&A. Okay, perfect. Okay, so so South Africa actually, I mean, is quite ahead of the game in terms of measuring the actual impact of COVID on learning losses amongst teachers. Amongst schools. And there have been a number of studies, first in 2020 and then in 2021, which looked specifically on the impact of school closures and rotational timetabling, etc., on reading. And these were smaller studies, but they were longitudinal studies, and they were largely studies that drew on research that had been done in schools, research projects that were running in schools that had tested learners prior to the pandemic. And so they were able to compare the performance of learners, say in grade 2, in pre-pandemic conditions, and then a similar group of learners during the pandemic. And so there were a range of tests across a range of projects conducted in 2020 and 2021. And that slide gives you a little bit of an indication of the kinds of losses of learning that were found there. But this year, and just published or just released this week, is a report based on a project that I was involved with, Sofas van der Berg, and other colleagues at Stellenbosch and UCT, which looked at learning losses in a much bigger sample and used evidence from the Western Cape systemic tests. Now, so this is a very large sample, and it's a very large sample even if one compares it to some of the international studies, but it gives us a good purchase on what's actually happened in relation to learning. So what the study estimates is that across 2020 and 2021, learners lost approximately 155 days over the 2 years. And this is actually a conservative estimate. Many schools lost much more. Many children reportedly didn't go back to school in 2020. There were high levels of teacher and learner absenteeism. So overall, that approximately 155 days is actually a conservative estimate. And the school days lost were initially as a result of the lockdowns and school closures. But then in particular, in the latter part of sorry, that should say 2020, not 2000. The latter part of 2020 and 2021, we had rotational timetabling. And that, although it varied across the country as to how, which schools actually adopted rotational timetabling, research has shown that about 80% of schools were engaged in some form of rotational timetabling. And, it varied considerably depending on where in the country the schools were and the size of classes. So during COVID last year, I mean, I did some research work in Limpopo, and there, the classes were so big that classes were split into 3. And so learners were coming to school, groups of learners were coming to school every 3rd day. So one of the teachers they reported to me that in term 2, she would see each learner on 16 days. So you get a sense of the extent of the learning loss and how that could vary. Other schools in Cape Town were fully open through 2021 with no rotations. So it had a lot to do with the size of the classes, in terms of how many students there were, and of course also the physical size of the classroom, and whether social distancing could be maintained. Fortunately, in February this year, those social distancing requirements were done away with, and so we had a return to normal schooling. So the interest really is in, well, what does that mean? What do those 155 days lost mean in terms of lost learning? The one thing that we do know is that school days lost does not translate directly into days of learning loss. And that is because children forget. So losing school days means much larger, generally, losses of learning. So if you remember, in 2020, schools ended. Most schools actually closed in around November, because there was another peak in that December, and the schools only went back on the 15th of February. So that would have been a 2.5 month break in schooling. Now, if you imagine a grade 2 student who's just begun to learn to read, those 2.5 months would mean that most of the learning that they had begun prior to the end of school would have been forgotten by the time they started schooling again. So days lost often means not the same amount of learning days lost, but a lot more. And there are various estimates that people use for this. The World Bank had a 1 to 1.5 day estimate. Some of our studies have shown sort of more of a 1 to 1.4 days of learning lost for every school day lost. So we were very keen to investigate these learning losses, and we used the Western Cape systemic tests. So these are tests that are written every year. They weren't written in 2020 because of the lockdowns, and they're written in maths and language by almost all of the schools in the Western Cape, so in grade 3, 6, and 9. And about 90,000 learners sit the test in each of those grades. So it's a very large sample of learners. The test is written at the grade 3 level in the language of learning and teaching in the school, so in Afrikaans, English, and isiXhosa. And so it's often that the test is written there in learners' home language. And then in grade 6 and 9, the language of learning and teaching, as you know, changes for schools who are serving mainly isiXhosa speaking children. That's in the Western Cape, and in the rest of the country for children who are learning in African languages in the foundation phase. So in our analysis, we refer to this as the Xhosa to English lot. And I'll tell you just now why it's of interest. So what we have in the sample is a large sample. It's a sample across different languages, and it's a sample across different quintiles. In other words, different levels of wealth of schools. So we've got different SES levels for learners. And so, although it's a Western Cape study, the findings are relevant to schools and learners nationally, because it picks up on different languages and on different quintile levels. So our main question in the study was, how far has the 2021 cohort in a particular grade fallen behind the performance of the 2019 cohort in the same grade? And what we did was the learners wrote the systemic test in 2019. They didn't write it in 2020. They wrote exactly the same test in 2021. although there were a few changes in some of the items. So we excluded those items and we included only items that were exactly the same. And we compared learner performance on those items. And the test basically comprises largely comprehension questions based on a fiction and a combination of fiction and non-fiction texts. And there are a few language questions, which we also excluded. So we excluded taught content, and we were really concerned with reading comprehension, vocabulary, and writing. So those were the areas that we were particularly interested in. So what the research showed, and some of you will have seen this research reported in the Business Day this week, is that overall and on average, what we find is that learners are about a year behind. So it differs by subject and it differs by grade level, but one can say overall that's the picture. But you can see that the learning losses are different at different levels. So I'm not going to speak much about maths because I know that wouldn't necessarily be a key interest of most of you here, but you can see that the learning losses were more severe in mathematics. And that's consonant with international findings. And it's probably got something to do with the fact that maths is a much more specialized subject and it requires formal instruction, whereas to some extent language aspects could potentially be picked up more informally, and in some cases through everyday reading as well. But you can also see that the losses were most severe at the grade 6 level. And you can see that the starting point of these learners was quite different at the different grades. So the grade 9s were performing better before COVID. And at the grade 3 level, the losses were off a very low starting base. So in general, the greatest declines were at the grade 6 level, and this was particularly in vocabulary. And one of the reasons that we think the declines were so great at this level is because this is after learners have transitioned from home language to English or Afrikaans as a language of learning and teaching. And this would really impact on learners who were making that transition because they wouldn't have been exposed to English or Afrikaans, and it's largely English, in 2 previous grades. So home language, the first 3 years, the transition to English, and that grade 4 would have been 2020 grade 5 would have been 2020 and grade 6 would have been 2021. So they would have missed out on 2 years of exposure to the language of the test as well. I hope that's clear. There was a greater decline in non-fiction at grade 3 level. And again, that's to be expected in that exposure to the vocabulary, especially around non-fiction or sort of factual topics and themes would have been missing in those grade 3 for those grade 3s in the 2 previous years. The greatest decline at the grade 3 and 6 levels was in the writing tasks. And writing, we know, has always been a curriculum area that's somewhat neglected. In the case of the curriculum changes, which I'll speak a little bit more about just now, writing was the one part of the curriculum that was trimmed. And of course, as we would expect in our schooling system, which is fundamentally characterized by inequalities, the losses varied hugely by quintile. So you found that there were much greater losses in the lower quintiles, and in fact, in some of the upper quintiles, in the Afrikaans schools, there were some gains on the test. and fewer losses in quintile 5 English medium schools. But for the lower quintiles, the poorer schools, the schools in poorer communities, the losses were much more severe. So we've heard it a number of times, but it's always worth restating, is that, of course, the impact on COVID, or the impact of COVID, was to really entrench and deepen the social inequalities, educational inequalities, nutritional inequalities, all of the inequalities in our society. And we see that very clearly on this test. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor for those of you who are interested in looking a bit more closely at the report, this is the kind of level of detail that I won't go into for each of the different levels, but here we can see that the average score on the language test at grade 3 fell from 40% to 36%. So that's equivalent to at least 80 school days, we see. The test was already found difficult in 2019, but those who couldn't actually pass it increased by 4%. Girls outperformed boys. The isiXhosa LOLT schools experienced a slightly smaller learning loss at this level than other LOLT groups. Remember, here they're writing in home language. The learning losses were generally small in quintile 5 schools, and the Afrikaans LOLT schools, as I mentioned, performed even better in 2021. So that's a sense of the kind of detail in the report for those of you interested in looking further. But how are learners doing before COVID? Well, I'm sure that many of you have come across this statistic, and it's derived from the PEARLS data. That's a big international study that measures reading, and on that study, South Africa's participation on that study showed that 78% of learners did not reach the low international benchmark. In other words, 78% of learners could not read for meaning in any language a simple text. So that's grade 5 learners. So lots of learners progressing through schooling, but not being able to adequately retrieve meaning from text. And Nick Spall and Lily Pretorius speak about this as falling at the first hurdle. So this issue of not being able to master the fundamentals of being able to read as they progress through school. And there, that graph shows the number of learners reaching that low international benchmark across the deciles. And again, you can see the huge inequalities in our system. So the 10 wealthiest percentage or the richest 10% of schools, 71% of learners reach that low international benchmark. 23% and 20% in the sort of top 70% or 60% of 40% of schools, and then in the bottom 60% of schools, it slowly declines in terms of how many learners are able to read with meaning at the grade 5 level. But the other thing that we know about the pre-pandemic state of reading was, and maths actually, is that what we were seeing was a very gradual improvement. So the system was improving, and this is something that often takes people by surprise, possibly because the media is so filled with gloom and doom about the state of education. But this key issue is missing often from the account, that when we look at the results on the big international studies that we participate in, most notably PEARLS, TIMSS, and SACMEC, they all showed a slight improvement or a gradual improvement, although off a very low base. And And in fact, Martin Gustafsson, who's part of the RECEP group that Conrad was talking about earlier, he argues that we'd reached our maximum speed limit, if you like. So we were improving as much as one could expect when you compare improvement rates to other countries. And that anything over that would suggest a kind of a gaming of the system or sort of a cheating. So we were on a pretty good trajectory, which makes the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on education all the more distressing. So if we think about that 78%, that sort of benchmark, how many now would fall below that benchmark? In other words, how many learners now would not be able to read for meaning? And if we take our findings from the systemic test and we extrapolate to the pearls, then we would find that that 78, which has been rounded up here to 80, would increase to 88%. So it would be 10% more learners would not be able to read for meaning or read with understanding in their own language at the grade 5 level. So I mean, the problem was big, and it's been compounded. Right. So what's been done? What kind of changes have we seen? It's easy to criticize the DBE, and I have been one who has, but it has also been an incredibly difficult environment in which to plan, because nobody knew how long the pandemic would go on for, when schools would close, when they would open. It was a constantly moving target. So what did happen? In 2020, the DBE trimmed the annual teaching plans. So they trimmed some of the curriculum, they removed some topics, and in particular in relation to language, they integrated life skills into home language and freed up time they specified for group guided reading. And they also introduced a reduction in writing tasks. So they removed the creative writing task at the intermediate and senior phases. They also reduced the number of assessments. So I think you'll remember they removed the June exams. They shortened the exam period for matrics, and they gave a much greater weighting to school-based assessment. They then did further trimming later in that year, which they called the fundamentals, where they realized that different schools had been affected so differently that what they needed to indicate to schools was that they needed to focus on the fundamentals, the main concepts, and do what they can. So to have an annual teaching plan which required all schools to do exactly the same thing, which was in existence, no longer made sense in a system where you had some children attending school every day and other children attending school once a week or once every week and a half. In 2021, they introduced the recovery ATPs, which were also a form of trimming, but they allowed 3 weeks to cover up missed content from 2020, which was completely unrealistic. And they also assisted teachers to some extent with baseline assessments. In terms of catch-up strategies, there have been no national programs. There have been lots of local initiatives, particularly in the production of materials for children to take home, but they are very localized and patchy. There was a TV program aimed at matrics for a while, but was relatively ineffectual. And in fact, all the online and remote solutions that were offered were not accessible, research has shown, to 80% of learners. So online and remote solutions to this sort of crisis of learning that emerged from the pandemic was not an appropriate solution in our context. Currently, there's no budget allocation for catch-up programs. The only thing that we have in play is the trimmed curriculum, and that appears to be inadequate. And the other thing that is sort of in play, but not necessarily directed at instruction, are the education assistants. And there have been some suggestions. Well, I'll speak a little bit to that. So just to insert here, see, I'm out of time. Okay, so I won't say much, but just quickly to say what the international research literature says is that you've got to have accelerated learning. You've got to catch up time. You've got to find time for catch up, and you've got to act fast, because otherwise these learning losses compound. So we make a number of recommendations in our report, and I'll just go through them really quickly, and you could have a look at them there. But I think maybe the interest is in thinking about where would the, I guess the role of librarians and the library fit into this. So we make specific recommendations around more trimming, particularly trimming of other subjects in order to support more focus on these gateway subjects of maths and language. Targeting particular areas, especially reading and writing in the foundation phase, and the need to act very quickly in the early grades because these losses compound, and across all grades to focus on the development of vocabulary and writing, especially. So these were things that we found in the tests that were affected specifically. And then to help teachers with diagnostic assessment to try and figure out where their learners are and where the losses are. And then we make a suggestion that in this next phase, phase 3 of the Presidential Youth Initiative, the education assistants, that these assistants be used to engage with learners one-on-one, helping them to catch up, using the rainbow workbooks if necessary. And the other possibility is for them to run a kind of a literacy boost, which has been shown to be effective in other countries. 40 books, a book goes home each week with 4 questions for the learners to talk about with their parents, and that could be managed by an education assistant. Or indeed, something like this literacy boost is something that maybe ideally would be something that libraries could do. And then just to end, I think, libraries potentially have a massive role to play, because in good times, the exposure to books is minimal. But after the last 2 years, we know how many books are generally in homes and how those are used, and it's wholly inadequate. So the role of the librarians now in trying to mitigate those losses, exposing learners to books, to reading, opportunities to read, is absolutely urgent. Thanks very much. I hope you could all see that.
Right, Professor.
I hope you're all there still.
So
it's very
much.
unnerving, these online presentations. You don't know if people are still there or they can hear you.
Sorry, we just missed that because we switched the microphone off and then we couldn't hear you. Right.
Oh, no, I was just saying,
so much for,
so often when...
for bringing all your research together in such a concise way. And yes, it's rather frightening. I think we all have a sense of that is what has happened. But to see the statistics, yeah, it really makes one's heart pound a little harder, and not necessarily in a good way. Thank you for your statement towards the end that the libraries definitely have a strong role to play. And that is now one of the opportunities here that we have today, is to talk about, what people are already doing, and if we can share some thoughts. So at the moment, I would like to offer opportunity for the people online to ask questions of Professor Hoadley. If you want to unmute your mic and just speak, that would be great. If you want to type into the chat block that would be great too. Professor Hoadley, can you just speak for a moment? I can see whether we can hear you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Okay, we can. I've just unplugged our loudspeakers to make sure that there isn't too much duplication of sounds and things. Okay, right. Is there anybody on our meet who would like to ask a question or make a comment of what Professor Hoadley said, or what your experiences in your schools and circumstances are? Okay, there's a question here from the room. Exactly what a literacy boost is, Professor Hoadley? Is that
so literacy boost? So Literacy Boost, I did a review in 2020 of I was interested in different responses to COVID. And it's a RECEP working paper, if anyone is interested, but looking at international responses to the school closures. And one of the things that came up in that review was a Save the Children initiative, which was a literacy boost, which had shown really, it had been evaluated and had shown really good effects. And what it did was it sent home a small book, and I think in some cases those were photocopied books, to learners, one a week for 40 weeks. And along with the book was a set of questions for parents to ask their children about the stories that they read. And I thought that was really innovative, because we have some research and we know that some children simply reading with parents doesn't always have the effect of encouraging reading for meaning or understanding, or even the enjoyment of stories, which are the things that we after. And that, you know, there've been some studies that show how parents will read with learners and you know, correct their punctuation, etc., rather than focusing on what the story means and having a discussion around it, which is what is really valuable. So this study included those questions to encourage that kind of interaction around text that is so crucial. So I just thought that it was a really good intervention because it's simple. I think it had some incentives for learners to actually read the books. I can't remember, but a very simple intervention which showed remarkable effects. And you know, that is a way of extending instructional time into the home. So it's very difficult to extend a school day. I mean, it's riven with problems, not least of all teacher workload, but then there are union issues and all kinds of things. So we've got to find innovative ways of extending school time, instructional time, without extending the school day. And extending instructional time into the home is one of those.
The fascinating element of that for me is the involvement of parents. I don't know whether your studies have focused on that, but that will surely be interesting to know how parents involve themselves with their children's learning on that kind of basic level. My mother used to be a pre-primary school teacher, and you know, usually when somebody has a new baby, she would ask, "Are you reading them stories yet? You know, the baby's 3 months old. Are you reading the baby stories yet?" And they would say no, and she would say, "You're 3 months behind." And
yeah, absolutely.
For some people that sounds logical, but for other people it's also not the approach.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, it plays into those kinds of inequalities that I spoke about earlier. You know, there's a figure from David Rose who shows that middle-class kids, by the time they arrive at school, they've had 1,000 hours of joint book reading with parents. So, you know, they are positioned to start reading in such a different way to learners who come to school without having been exposed to books at all. And that is the majority of our learners. But the one thing about COVID that has emerged, and it's much more anecdotal, you know, there's no hard research evidence of it, but you hear it a lot, is that parents actually across the socioeconomic levels became a lot more engaged with their children's learning than they had before. So they interacted with the school on a level that was unprecedented. You know, even if it meant going to collect workbooks, and there were various attempts by most schools to send work home. So I think that that is something that we can potentially build on. You know, parents are more in touch, I think, with their children's schools and their children's learning, ironically, although there was so little going on, than they ever have been.
Okay, so spinning off from that, you know, with our image of being back on track doesn't mean that the parents can now disengage. We must encourage them to carry on. I don't know, some of the people on this call might know the book by the French author Daniel Pennock that was translated as The Rights of the Reader. In the English translation is beautifully illustrated by Quentin Blake. And one of the things that struck me from that is that many parents, once their children can read on their own, they stop reading with the children. And I wonder whether, you know, especially, and also perhaps, you know, in higher levels where there are more devices and things like that, parents can also, you know, just leave the children to get on with it instead of having that interaction. I hope that that can be encouraged to maintain at a high level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think something like that literacy boost it's simple, you know, and it's clear to parents what's required of them, and it's not terribly demanding. But I think a focus, you know, particularly on the early grades, but across the grades and on the, you know, learners who've transitioned to a different language of instruction, it's absolutely crucial to try and support the development of reading there, because if that's not mastered, then really, you know, the rest of schooling is compromised.
Yeah, that is so true, and something that you also said is, you know, the compounding of the learning backlog. If it's not caught up early, you know, it just increases, and we sit with matrics that we, you know, have to spoon feed and, you know, kind of put on crutches through the matric exams and so on. And then, you know, obviously then it has a knock-on effect on universities and the successes there and so on. I see Christine Moritz saying in the chat, perhaps if too much time goes by and nothing is done now, we will lose that golden opportunity to make use of this greater parental involvement. So I would think that one of the things that we as librarians can take up is to communicate through whatever communication channels they might be between the school and the parents, newsletters or email, or whatever is possible, you know, to make suggestions and to involve, you know, to encourage their involvement with the reading. Obviously joined with the language teachers. One can advertise books that parents can come and take out to the school, children take home for the parents to read with them, or things like that. I don't know. Yeah, but just to market that element the whole time. I think the marketing of school libraries and school book collections should almost have a new frenetic intensity, I would almost want to say, making the parents aware of what is available so that they can use it to support their engagement with their children.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it is a golden opportunity. And I think it is important to harness the moment. And I think it's one thing that, you know, is a little bit disappointing. And that's why I'm glad that, you know, I mean, the results of this research are devastating. But on the other hand, I'm glad that it's got out there, because I don't think that there is a sense of urgency. And the point is that these learners are progressing. And we've got, you know, because the assessment requirements were relaxed, we've got kids moving through the system who are not ready. You know, that we've got a lot more grade 11s this year and grade 12s this year than we would in normal years, because they're moving through the system and they're moving through with backlogs. And so this urgency really needs to be grasped for a lot more concerted action.
Yeah, we can't really afford another borderline lost generation of any sorts. Okay.
Yeah, look, it is difficult to predict. And I know, I mean, someone asked this question of Safas the other day, and he said, you know, it's probably not a generational issue. It's probably, you know, we're looking the next 7 to 8 years, which is significant. You know, but it's difficult to predict. But I think that issue of compounding, you know, issues compounding, and the divide between kids who are catching up and getting on and those who've been left behind is going to be greater. So again, one's going to have greater inequalities as we go on.
Yeah. Right, Professor Hoadley. I don't see any more questions in the chat room. I don't know whether the room wants to ask anything. At that point, then, thank you so much for speaking to us. The good news,
Pleasure.
I hope the good news for you is that we have a gift from Exclusive Books to send to you electronically, which we will do. And you will also find some communication from NB Publishers. They've offered you a year's free access to all their online dictionaries.
Wow, wonderful.
So I
Thank
hope
you.
that is valuable to you.
That is very good news for me.
Yeah,
Thank
okay.
you.
Wonderful. I thank those sponsors again for their involvement there.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for the wonderful work that you do. School libraries are really so important and central to the whole project around reading.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's something that we kind of sense for ourselves, but it's always fantastic to know that there is hard research, statistics, empirical research that proves that. So thank you for what you do on that level as well.
Pleasure.
Right, Professor Hoadley. Obviously, you're welcome to stay on the meet and listen to our other bits and pieces if you would like to, but we will also understand if you and your neighbor want to have a cup of tea.
I think they might want their office back, yes.
Well, thank
you very much, and good luck for the rest.
And a last thank you to you, particularly for being so positive about your participation today all along. From the very first time I emailed her, there was just an immediate response, yes, let's do it. So it worked out wonderfully, despite all the hurdles, and
yes,
we're very pleased that you've been here with us this morning.
Great,
Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Right, ladies and gentlemen, it is now 11 o'clock. I think we must take our break now, and then at 11:15 we get together again. And then Christopher Lloyd
Good morning, and thank you.
There is Christopher. Good morning. We're just ready to take our break. While this is happening, Heidi is going to play 2 videos that NB Publishers has sent us, and then we're going to there's some other bits and pieces that she's going to show. I think Heidi, we can do all the prize draws and things right at the end. Right. Okay, there's a comment by Irene Reed. An interesting article to read is by Susan Ledger and Margaret Merger, reading aloud children's attitudes towards being read to at home and at school. Yes. Okay, that will surely be valuable things. We will see if we can get hold of it and distribute it to all of us. Right, people, Heidi is going to put on the videos and the soft jazz that she's got in the can. And then I will switch on again at 11:15 to introduce Christopher Lloyd. Enjoy tea, coffee, water, whatever.
Good morning, and thank you for NB Publishers to recommend some youth novels in English and Afrikaans for your libraries. Have a look at all these titles. You will also see some extra information on the slides following, where some of these novels have teacher's guides or reading guides available free from our website that the teachers can use in the classroom as prescribed novels. The title Donkerweb Skooluitgawe by Fanie Viljoen is the new prescribed novel for the IEB Afrikaans First Additional Languages Grade 12 as from 2023. This is a sequel to the popular book Onderwêreld by Fanie Viljoen. Greg Owen, former head boy at Lawson College and hacker of note, is a first-year student at Maties. His life of privilege fell apart in his matric year when his father, along with Lawson's rector Dr. Pinaar, were revealed as the masterminds behind Project Nursery Rhyme. But the baker is still at large. Greg won't rest until he's behind bars too. But if you want revenge, be prepared to take 2 graves. This is a shortened school edition of the best-selling follow-up to Onderwêreld. The Sanlam Youth Literature Gold winner for 2021, The Swim Team by Catherine Jarvis. When 16-year-old Kitiwe is given a swimming scholarship to a Johannesburg private school, she bumps up against Farah, the swimming captain. As a poor girl, Kitiwe is already struggling to fit in, but Farah sets out to make her life unbearable. When the 2 girls clash over Aiden, Farah's ex-boyfriend, Farah's become even more unhinged. The constant bullying is starting to seriously affect Kitiwe. But when she tries to defend herself, things turn even out for worse. Ander Kan Die Blou by Zelda Besuidenhout tells the story of Linka and Desi's Kalpai holiday as the best ever. At the hotel, they meet Dan Roy, who waited for the holidays. When he invites them on a sightseeing trip, they meet his friends and his beloved Uncle Cass, and a different view of Kalpai, as the locals see it, starts to unfold. Then a tragedy at sea turns Dan Roy and his mom's life inside out. As Uncle Cass liked to say, you need only 3 things to be happy. Someone to say, I love you, someone to keep you occupied, and something to look forward to. Luntu Masisa Tells the Truth by Penny Lorimer is a Silver Award winner for the Sanlam 2021 Youth Literature Competition. The story takes the form of a series of emails written by Luntu Masisa to his grade 11 English and history teacher, Mr. Bali, to fulfill a school holiday